Welcome to the Mission Brain Podcast, the official podcast of the Mission Brain Foundation, bringing insights into the fascinating realm of global neurosurgery.
We are put in a box and told you operate a certain way, and when it comes to writing papers, we can bring our personal flavor to our work and still fit it within the square peg of modern neurosurgery. And that's the beauty of creativity and the creative processing.
Michael Lawton is president and CEO of the Barrow Neurological Institute and chairman of its neurosurgery department, as well as co-founder with Dr. Quinones of the Mission Brain Foundation. Dr. Lawton's neurosurgical expertise is mainly centered on cerebrovascular disorders and skull-based tumors. In his more than 30 years in neurosurgery, he treated more than 5,000 aneurysms, removed more than 1,000 AVMs, and operated on more than 1,000 cavernous malformations. His research studies the formation, underlying genetics, and rupture of brain AVMs, the computational modeling of brain aneurysms, and the anatomy of microsurgical approaches, as well as aneurysm, AVM, and bypass surgery. We already spoke in a long-form interview during our mission trip to Mexico City in September of 2022. However, the audio and video quality of the interview, given the circumstances, was dismal, as we had to make time in between surgeries in the midst of a very busy schedule. Although we will probably not release it all at once, we will be releasing the most salient excerpts of it in the near future for our audience benefit. Dr. Lawton, it's great to see you again, and it's great to have you on the show.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
We'll get to your involvement with the foundation, but many of our listeners, of course, are very interested in you, and more precisely, what makes you you. As you know, many of our listeners are medical students and residents in lower middle income countries, and you're clearly an impressive neurosurgeon, possibly one of the best in the world. However, you also trained in the best training centers one could desire. Ultimately, what shaped you into who you are, and what do you feel are the tools you had access to throughout your journey that training neurosurgeons in lower middle income countries still prevalently lack to this day?
This is always a fascinating topic and a very interesting question. What makes neurosurgeons who they are, or what makes them tick, if you will? I guess I would say that I just have always loved the art and practice of neurosurgery. And when you love something and your passion is driving you forward, then I think that's what makes you tick. When I started my career, you're right, I did have the blessing of going to the best medical schools and the best training programs, and I feel very fortunate to have wound up in those environments. But, I think two things really stand out. One is that I was surrounded in all of those places with people that were incredibly high quality. My medical student class at Johns Hopkins was extraordinary. There are 4 or 5 chairmen in neurosurgery from my class of 120 students from Hopkins, and you can throw in Al Sills, who's chief medical officer of the NFL. I mean, it's really an extraordinary collection of talent and intelligence all wrapped up into one. And so I think, when you're in that kind of an environment, you end up soaking it up and wanting to keep up with the pack, if you will, or be in the same discussion as these other great minds and other great leaders. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is just finding something that you're really passionate about. And sometimes it's not always so easy. When I was a medical student, I worked in the lab of Henry Brem, and he, of course, is a brain tumor neurosurgeon at Hopkins. And my early research was on tumor angiogenesis. I thought, this was sort of my calling to become a neurosurgical oncologist. And there were a lot of reasons why it intrigued me. It was hard to understand. It seemed like exciting cases to be doing, and just the whole idea of helping patients deal with a tragic diagnosis like a GBM, I thought really challenging. But, as it turns out, it wasn't my final calling. I came to the Barrow and met Dr. Spetzler, worked with Dr. Spetzler, and realized that I was much more fascinated by vascular cases. The technical challenge was much higher. The case complexity was much higher. And just the overall gratification at the end of a case was greater. So, I switched. And I think finding something that you really love is what you need to fuel your success, because it's a long haul. I'm 30 years, as you said, into my career. I've been in practice for 26 years. I've been in training. I was in training for an additional 7. So it's a long time, and you've got to be doing things that sustain your interest and allow you to be as passionate after 30 years as you are after 1 year. And for me, I'm not bored. I'm stimulated and challenged and constantly striving to be better in what I do. There is no complacency. There is no fatigue or anything. It's just remarkable to me how it's been such a great sustained run. So I think those are the two things. Surround yourself with really great people and people that challenge you to be better than who you think you are. And then find something that ignites that fire inside so you can keep it burning.
Let's try to unpack that a little bit, even giving it a global surgery perspective. So let's go through a thought experiment. If you had grown up, let's say in Tanzania, because we may go there later on.
Mm-hmm.
If you hadn't had access to many things that you had access to, I mean, you would have still maybe had a good mentorship, but do you think you would be Michael Lawton today, the Dr. Michael Lawton we all know about?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very valid point, and I think that there's no question that if I, for example, was born and raised in Tanzania, I would not be thinking about how to master a basilar tip aneurysm because I might see one of those every 3 years in Tanzania, whereas I'd be seeing head trauma after hydrocephalus after spine fracture in the ER in a Tanzanian type environment. So it would have changed my focus. And so I don't think that I would have been able to be Michael Lawton if I had been there. So you're right. But that said, what came to mind was Rokuya Tanikawa, who, he's a Japanese neurosurgeon who's, I think, one of the best. And he was in a northern province in Japan. And I think just through his passion and his inherent talents, he kind of rose up in Japan to be, I think, one of the very best vascular neurosurgeons, despite being in a province where maybe he wasn't seeing a lot of that. And, if there was a special neurosurgeon in a low income country like Tanzania who had some unusual ability to do vascular neurosurgery, I think, that would come ultimately to the surface. It would bubble up. And it may be that, when that first microscope comes into the operating room there and he or she gets a chance to work under the scope and see what his hands can do, that might propel him to ultimately get on that pathway towards what I have been doing. And, it may not be possible to reach the same height coming from that environment, but I think that's the sort of American dream of neurosurgery. If you have that passion and ambition and you have the talent and you follow it, you may get to that highest point on the pyramid eventually. It's a harder journey, but I think you get there. I can tell you that it hasn't been a walk in the park for me. When I came as a resident to the BNI in 1991, people were saying, well, you want to do vascular, but every paper has already been written that Dr. Spetzler has innovated on. Somebody's already written up cardiac standstill. Somebody's already written a bypass surgery. Somebody's already written a grading system for AVMs. And they would say, what are you going to do that hasn't already been done? And I just ignored it. And I said, okay, well, let's just go a step further or a level deeper. And we'll keep asking better questions or more relevant questions. And, you get there and you find ways to make contributions and write papers, publish papers, do more cases, innovate. Same is true now. The cards are stacked against us in vascular because of how much the world has changed with endovascular technology. And, people may say, well, you can't be a prominent vascular neurosurgeon anymore because look at what you're up against. And I would just say that, again, going back to our first principles, if you have passion and you have an aptitude for something and you just listen to those two guiding things as your true north, then you'll find a way. My life story is a great example. I mean, it's true that my aneurysm volume is diminishing, and it's true that a lot of things that used to be done open are now being done with endovascular devices. But I'm still extremely busy, as I'm doing as many cases today as I did 20 years ago. The mix is different, but I'm a believer and almost a crusader for microneurosurgery and us as surgeons using our hands and our our creativity to be surgeons. Surgery is all about using hands. That's where the word comes from. And there's longevity in that. And to get back to your question, I do think that for those who are listening in resource poor countries, I would just say to you, listen to your heart and find out what you're passionate about. And if it is something as complicated as brain tumors or aneurysms, there's still a place for you to pursue that. And then listen to your skills, listen to your hands. What are you best at? Where can you be the guy who's doing it better than anybody else? And if that's in the realm of brain tumors or aneurysms, then you go there.
Wow, a lot to unpack there. So you mentioned this concept of bubbling up, right? These people that are worthy all around the world. We need to find them a way or another, or they could find themselves. But how do we find the Michael Lawtons? I mean, do they just find themselves and end up in the United States or in Europe to train, or do we have a duty to find them and to train them and to have them see the light?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very Darwinian question. And I'm going to give you a Darwinian answer, which is that the survival of the fittest. And there's a natural selection that happens in life, whether it's in the Serengeti Plains and you're a lion or a zebra, or if it's in neurosurgery. If you are unusually adapted or gifted in some way, then nature will select you to rise up. And the combination of the individual and the system. I think what's beautiful about being a leader and a senior neurosurgeon is that we can somehow create ways or systems to recognize these people. Like the hackathon's a great example. The hackathon is a way to give young people a platform to express creativity. And when they express creativity and you can see that as being unusual or unique or special, then you can award them a prize and you can give them attention, and all of a sudden you know their name, you know where they're coming from, you know their idea, and they have an advantage or they have a start. And in the same way, those that aren't gifted, those that aren't creative, they don't get that recognition. And they're in the Darwinian perspective, they're passed over or selected out. And I think that's kind of how the world works. And so, I think it's like the NCAA championship basketball tournament finished last night. And I'm not a huge basketball fan, but the idea is that, if you have a basketball and a hoop in your backyard and you're in a cornfield in the middle of America and you love basketball and you do nothing but shoot hoops and you get to be so good and so poised and confident that when you get on a team and that team gets in a tournament and that tournament gets your team in a position where you're in the limelight and you perform and you hit that game-winning shot, that's something that the individual controls. That's sort of the opposite end of that spectrum, where you as the Darwinian participant control your destiny because you've prepared and you've trained. On the flip side, creating the tournament or creating the hackathon or creating a neurosurgical platform where these people shine, that's on the leadership. But it's a combination of the two. And I do think that I'm hopeful that those special individuals, whether they're in Tanzania or anywhere in the world, low or high income, hear this and say, okay, well, I'm just going to go out there and be the best. I'm going to sew stitches into the armchair of my rocking chair, or I'm going to grab some plastic tubings, or I'm going to get some chicken thighs at the supermarket and practice my suture technique. That's going to be the person who, gets in the game and shoots the winning score, if you will.
I love that you brought up the hackathon because I think it's a great example of creating the playing field and then letting evolution do its job. And
Yeah.
also, another thing I wanted to talk to you about is how there are already today so many resources that 2-3 years ago were not around for people in lower middle income countries to learn about surgery and to learn about all sorts of things within training in surgery. We were mentioning that during the pandemic, you launched the 7 series, which is a series of narrated case studies with histories, imaging studies, and illustrations. And I confess that I am a very avid fan of the 7 series. so valuable, and it's available online for free. And you advertise it on your social media page. And my question is, how important is this kind of project to you? And in what context did the need for something like this arise?
Yeah. Well, it really warms my heart to hear you say that, because this is exactly the intention in starting 7 Series, was to make it available, make it engaging, and to stir interest. Years ago, I had this idea that, well, I mean, you said it earlier, I am in a place that's unique. Being at Barrow or being at UCSF previous to this, I get to do these incredible cases. And it always struck me as unfair that only my residents get to learn from what I'm doing. And if you boil it down even further, only my resident who's in that room with me gets to learn from that case. And so this invaluable experience then has benefit to one person or a handful of people. And that's just wrong. So the idea was to find a way to capture what was happening anyways and disseminate it into the world, so that instead of my having one resident in one case or 28 residents in a residency where we talk about a case, have the entire world have a window to the kind of that I have, because I think it's unique now, particularly in this endovascular era, so that we create what I often refer to as a virtual residency. Anyone who engages with 7 Series and spends the time to watch what we put out is essentially like going through a residency at the BNI. They don't necessarily have to be a chosen resident here and take call or make rounds or do the things that are part of a standard residency training apprenticeship, but they get to learn from the case, which is the real crown jewel or the real plum where a lot of this learning happens. And so, instead of having 28 residents under one roof here, I feel like I'm creating a school of potentially thousands of residents if they like what I do and they watch me. And to me, that's what technology is all about. That's what this world that we live in today is all about, is using these platforms and this technology to amplify our message in the world. And if we can amplify the message and get it out and have it be impactful to a broader audience, then that's really technology applied for the best use. Now, not everybody likes what I do. I follow my social media and I see, I might get 3 new followers one day and then I see 3 unfollowers. So some people maybe get grossed out by the videos, or they think that I'm doing too much open surgery and not enough endovascular surgery, or I don't know what. But so I think there's the people who do engage and do follow see value in what I'm trying to do in sharing my practice essentially with the world. And if they're learning and if they're benefiting, then I score that as a win. And what's been really heartening to me was I did this during the pandemic, and I stopped traveling for 2 years, 2.5 years. And when I started traveling after that, after the pandemic was over and meetings happened again, all of a sudden people started coming up to me and saying, wow, thank you for what you did during the pandemic. Thank you for 7 Series. Thank you for the videos. Thank you for all the social media activity. And, honestly, I found it so rewarding, because here I was all those years prior writing paper after paper after paper. And, people don't read the way that they watch social media videos. And so, you might have some people comment on a publication in JNS or neurosurgery. But here in this post-pandemic world, having people comment about the 7 Series with the intensity that they did and the gratitude that they did really struck a nerve with me. So I feel really validated. I feel really rewarded by this. I have to say it's one of the most exciting and most proud things that I think I've done, ranking up there with some of the books I've written.
I have a few questions about this. I'm curious on the amount of people that watch these videos. Do you have an estimate, like a rough estimate, when it comes to the amount of people that watch each of the videos that you put out?
I have data from my team that tracks a lot of this stuff. And There are some videos I was just going to pull up as a case in point. The last video that I posted, this was something that I posted on Friday, and I can just tell you that I have 6,242 views, and the people that actually clicked on the video and watched the video, that's 1,589, and that's in, what is that? Let's call it 4 days.
Wow.
That's extraordinary. I mean, if I was an honored guest at the Congress of Neurological Surgeons next month at the annual meeting, if I got 1,000 people into the auditorium, I consider that not only a victory, but it would give me palpitations at the podium, right? But here, on social media, I've reached 6 times that in very short order. And I can tell you that some of my videos have been viewed like 70,000 times, probably more as time goes by. So, I think the numbers are really extraordinary. And I think when you put it into the context of neurosurgeons in the world, there's only supposed to be like 50,000 neurosurgeons in the world when you count the US.
Yeah, I was about to bring that up.
Yeah. And so, these numbers are remarkable. That means that with any one tweet, I'm potentially hitting a big percentage of the neurosurgical community. And maybe I'm hitting a bunch of high school seniors who are contemplating a career in medicine and they get inspired by seeing what a brain looks like. Or maybe I'm connecting with a bunch of medical students who are deliberating about whether to do neurosurgery versus neurology and they see these videos and what a surgeon can do and get inspired to go that direction. Who knows who all of these viewers are, but the point is that the technology has created a vehicle now where we can make these connections. And, I think that changes the world. One of the things that Mission Brain you hear over and over again is how can we go out there and change the world? And this is changing the world, using technology and sharing knowledge, sharing experience in ways that inspire, train, teach, provoke, whatever, people to be better.
This is actually a paradigm shift. Have you ever thought about taking this project to the global scale, maybe on a bigger platform, maybe featuring cases and procedures from all around the world? I mean, I think it would be very interesting to see how people do the same procedure in two different parts of the world with different resources.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to say that I definitely jumped on the vanguard of this when the pandemic hit. And I would venture to say that there are noticeably more surgical videos on social media today, 3 to 4 years down the road, than there were before I started this. And it's not just me, it's a lot of leaders in neurosurgery and in other specialties who have embraced this. And I think that, taking this as global as we can take it is something I do believe in. I envision a world where in 10 years, every surgeon should have to have videos online. If you're gonna buy a car and you're gonna put your money down on a car, you should be able to drive the car. You should be able to sit in the car. You should be able to get all the specs on the car. And when you go to put your brain on an operating room table and have it opened, you can't get any information on the surgeon. You can't watch how he operates. You can't see what her statistics are. You can't get the kind of information that might help you make an informed decision. And I believe that that's where we need to go. I call it the consumerization of surgery. And that to me is the paradigm shift that would be revolutionary.
It's got lots of implications that I've been thinking about just now. I mean, one is if there was a platform outside of social media, I think it would be nice to have a platform like a YouTube for surgery that is very location based and based on the kind of procedure and very organized. Because in social media, I can see Dr. Lawton's procedure, but I can get distracted by other things. So it would be nice to, of course, keep posting on social media, but also have a place where all this material is in a very organized manner.
Yeah, well, that place, that's a great segue because that place exists. We have something which we call Barrow Neuro TV, and it looks like this. And when you go,
we'll link.
When you go to Barrow Neuro TV and sign in, you can actually search by diagnosis. Let's say you can say, all right, let's look at 10 of Dr. Lawton's basilar aneurysm cases. and it will pull from 7 series and co-videos those cases, and you can view in a more organized way. And I think that's the platform you're alluding to. And this is this whole concept of taking a residency, capturing all the different elements, and putting them up so that people can use them, whether they're residents at Barrow or not residents at Barrow. And this is that virtual residency concept that I think has real power.
Would you be willing, for example, to open this up in a very structured way to other surgeons from other countries, their surgeries, and maybe, I don't know, there's somewhere in the world where they do something very specifically in a very interesting way. Wouldn't it be nice to have that on the same platform?
Yeah. Well, I am open to that. And, I've always felt like it's hard to get people to move. There's too much inertia in the world. It's the second law of thermodynamics. It takes energy to get to a state beyond chaos and order. So, I've always felt like if ever we're going to move the needle, we've got to lead it. And so I've always viewed myself as kind of the pilot. And I've been hopeful that others will take up the gauntlet and do the same. So, yeah, if there's a tumor surgeon who wants to do a 7 series for tumors, if there's a spine surgeon who wants to do a series on their techniques, if there's another vascular surgeon who wants to do a little counterpoint to the way I do things, I mean, these are the kinds of online forums that I think have real value. And, when you stand back and you think about it, that's what a journal is. If you look at operative neurosurgery, or if you look at neurosurgical focus, these are meant to be exactly that. There'll be a topic, there'll be a focus, and there'll be a collection of videos address a particular theme. But I can tell you, the peer review process for a journal has gotten to the point where it's a drag on the spirit. They're sometimes hostile and vindictive, and they're sometimes overbearing. I think most of us, when we publish, we want to just collect our thoughts, put them down on paper or on video, and express them to the world. And the peer review process can sometimes take the joy out of it, because you end up having to go through checklists and resubmissions and quality checks and peer reviews that are nasty and revisions and so forth. And, I think the way that this becomes successful is that if it's painless and joyful. And I haven't found that other than doing it the way I'm doing it now, which is through my own curated, created 7 series, which I have some control and freedom with.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Actually, it made me think about a question. So, as you mentioned previously, I can't help but think that you came up with all these surgical techniques, and before these techniques, other inferior techniques were the golden standard. As I remember, we were speaking about this in Mexico City. Brainstem cavernous malformations were once considered inoperable. So, how do you move past dated ideas in neurosurgery? Is it through clinical trials and evidence-based big data, or are there other factors involved, such as the platform you're publishing it on, or the authority of the neurosurgeon coming up with the technique, or common sense?
Yeah.
And generally speaking, surgeon, do you trust evidence-based medicine more versus human ingenuity and intuition? And what most contributes to technical breakthroughs in surgery?
Yeah, well, so you got to be really careful with social media. And one of the things that I've been very careful to do is when I post a video of a case, let's say a controversial case or a case that has some novelty, I've been very deliberate in pairing that with a publication. So, I'll tweet an article and then I will then post the video that follows. And so that's very deliberate, because I think it's important, as you say, if you're gonna advance the field and make a change in the way neurosurgery is practiced, it does need to go through peer review, because that's the way that you authenticate your ideas, you validate your ideas, and you affect change. You can't just be a renegade and go do something that's heretical or wildly different. You have to have gone through a process of experimentation in the laboratory, safety trials, and then finally application to a case, a clinical case. And in the case of trials, you need to, design a trial and have control groups and process and methodology and so forth. So I think you do need to go through a different process when you're trying to change practice. And you have to go through the journals and the peer review because that gives you some foundation to stand on. If I just did some crazy bypass for some aneurysm something that comes to mind is my binder ring bypass. This was a bypass that I did instead of a microvascular or a macrovascular decompression to decompress the cranial nerves. If I just threw that on social media, people could say, well, that's a little bit unhinged. Why should we allow him to get away with that? But I only did that after I wrote it up, submitted it to the journals, subjected the paper to peer review, responded to the criticisms and so forth. And then by pairing the video with the paper, it gives me some immunity to those who would say, well, that was reckless. And I think that's, to get back to your question, that's how you make the advances. I think you can use your platform to spread the idea, but you first need to validate the idea through the peer review process that gives you some strength behind it.
Do you ever encounter any what you feel to be unreasonable resistance when it comes to introducing novel ideas and techniques and paradigm shifts such as this one?
Oh yeah, there's always resistance. I think people like things done a certain way and they get comfortable. So when you do something that's a little bit different, there's natural resistance to that. As a resident, I remember seeing that all the time. I would write papers with Dr. Spetzler and we'd get reviews back and they would be really vicious. And he would say, well, okay, I want you to take these reviews and you're not me, so you can be more impartial than I would have been. I want you to write the response to this. And so this is age old. It happens all the time. And I think when you're a young neurosurgeon writing your first couple of papers, I think people are very welcoming because they view you as a newcomer to the fold and they want to support young ideas. I think sometimes as you get older, there's a little bit more resistance because other emotions creep in. There's also some advantages too, like for me to publish a paper at my stage of the career, where I have thousands of cases rather than just 20 cases, makes a big difference in the acceptability of the paper. So there's also some huge advantages that come. But yeah, there's always a little bit of double edge to the sword.
So if I was a young resident, right, and I am convinced that I have a breakthrough or that I'm doing something better than the status quo, what would be the best way to demonstrate this and to prove it and see if this is actually applicable to a large patient population? How did you do it at the beginning?
Well, I think the best way to prove it is through a series of steps that takes you from laboratory testing to safety, demonstrations of efficacy to a clinical trial. I mean, it's the natural progression through a research idea from inception to validation. And I think that's really the best way. I think surgeons have a different challenge. A lot of surgical trials are hard to do, and it's much harder to do a controlled trial with a surgical procedure because you don't have a placebo arm. You can't disguise your surgical intervention. But that said, you can review a clinical series and you can show efficacy. You can compare it to matched controls, and there are definitely ways that you can try and demonstrate that a particular variation of a technique is better. And I think those are the standard ways, and they are very convincing. It's not as convincing as the double-blind randomized controlled trial that you see in medicine, but in surgery, you can do things that can be convincing and change the discourse.
Do you remember the first time that you did something truly novel and that you discovered something that nobody else had thought about before or that nobody else had applied before?
Well, yeah, there are a couple of categories. The way my mind works is that I like to study collections of things and try and bring order to the chaos. So like, for example, tentorial dural fistulas, when I looked at all my tentorial dural fistulas and saw that there were these different types and each one was a little different, and came out with a classification for that. That was novel. A new grading system for AVMs that looks at age, bleeding, and compactness didn't exist before, and I put that together, and that is something I use all the time now when I'm making my decisions about whether to operate on an AVM. The taxonomy for brainstem cavernous malformations, nobody put that one together before, and I like to take that challenge and study all the nuance and piece that whole concept together. So, those are examples where just by studying the pathology and dissecting apart the different categorization of these things has been really helpful to me, and I've translated those into grading scales or taxonomies that hopefully others embrace and will use. I think the other area of innovation for a surgeon is a new procedure, and to me, those are the ones that are the most meaningful, because like when I think of a bypass that's never been done before, like the azygos bypass that connects all the anterocerebral arteries in the hemispheric fissure, or our double reimplantation bypass, which was the first time that had been described for a middle cerebral bifurcation aneurysm. These are novel things that didn't exist in the literature, and all of a sudden we write them up, we show the pictures, we do the illustrations, and they're out there. And then before you know it, people start doing it, and they say, "Wow, that's here's my double reimplantation bypass, or here's my version of the azygos bypass." And that to me is really rewarding. I think it's fun because some people, like myself, get a real thrill out of the creative process. Writing a book is the perfect example. When you write a book, it's the end product of a creative process, and it's tangible. It's like there, you can hold it, and everybody can read it and get to the same mental place that you're at. And that's the beauty of creativity and the creative process. And so, I think that to me is really exciting. I feel like when you have a tangible product that comes from the creative process, whether it's a book or a bypass or a new surgical technique, there's nothing better.
Let's start with something that I noticed that I really liked about 7 Series is how poetic you are in your choice of words. When we speak about the piloresection technique of an eccentric intramedullary cervical AVM, you refer to the tangle of arteries and veins as a spectacular freak of nature, explosion of hemodynamic energy and red fury, something that is fearsome, beautiful, and almost untouchable. And when it comes to creativity, I wonder how important it is for a surgeon to connect spiritually with the extraordinary nature of his profession and his art, and not just go through the motions and react passively to what is in front of him.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I've really tried to do a lot of in my career, is to speak with a personal voice and also raise the level of spirituality a notch. We are put in a box and told you operate a certain way, and when it comes to writing papers, you write in a certain way, and that's it. When you write a paper, it's introduction, methods, results, discussion, end of story. There's no variation. And that's fine, but you can't be poetic if you just accept that. And the same is true in surgery. If you're told patient needs a bypass, it's STMCA bypass, and this is how you do it, then, that's all you get. But if you find a way to build in these other things, whether it's the innovative bypass or the poetry in your papers, I think that's when it gets really exciting. And I learned that early. When I wrote one of my earliest papers on basilar aneurysms, I didn't want to just write about my results, because it's hard to think of much that I could say that was new or different. But I talked about the personal experience of going through the learning curve, and I had to speak with a personal voice. So I wrote the paper myself. I had no co-authors, and it gave me license to speak in the first person. And I did that within the context of that intro, methods, results, discussion. And I think the lesson there is that we can all do this. We can bring our personal flavor to our work and still fit it within the square peg of modern neurosurgery. It's just, it takes a little extra effort. And if you do it, I've always believed that people will take notice. And the fact that you quoted that line from 7 AVMs is proof positive that it makes a difference. If you can speak in a language that gets people to kind of jump out of the page a little bit and think about it in a different light, you stand a better chance of getting your message through. Writing is a challenge because people don't like to read generally, and people don't read that much. So you really have to find a way to make the reading process more engaging. And that's what I've tried to do. And that's what I've liked about my books, is that they're not peer reviewed. I do have some poetic license to be that way. And there's some of the most fun things to do is to sit and find ways to really pull out that experience of surgery onto the page and get people to relate to it somehow.
Wow, that's very beautiful. So I think it's impossible not to speak about the fact that we are in the very midst of an AI revolution. New systems have been growing at rates that were previously unheard of and unexpected by most. And it is estimated that most cognitive jobs will become irrelevant in the next few years. So, first of all, how should a physician, and secondly, a surgeon, contend and make peace with this notion? And how should we integrate artificial intelligence in our profession while maintaining humans in charge?
Well, that perception or that belief is probably a bit overstated, in my opinion. I don't think that all cognitive human thought is going to be replaced by AI. The way I view AI is that it's able to do things that our human brains can't do. There's no way that we can process thousands of records to find commonalities amongst them in the way that AI algorithm can. But at the same time, you can't expect a computer to come up with some of these surgical techniques or these really novel ideas about how to make decisions in neurosurgery. I think it's important that we view AI as a tool, something that we as humans can use to extend our understanding of the world, and not as a threat or as a replacement. So that's kind of how I view it. I am fascinated by AI. I'm an engineer by college training, so I really am intrigued to see how we can implement this. But at the end of the day, I feel like we can't just sort of cede control of something that is a human specialty, surgery, a craft really, to something that is really a technology that can't do surgery. A robot today cannot do a bypass that I can do, and it can't decide how to manage a patient as well as I can, because I am a thinking, feeling human being. And so you have to view these things as tools. Maybe AI can make us a little bit better at our selection process than my grading scale. But at the end of the day, we still have to be the ones that pull the trigger on that decision. And the AI is going to be a tool and not an interference.
In the past years, we have witnessed the erosion of microsurgical case volume due to advances in endovascular and radiosurgical therapies, as well as medical management. Do you believe that this trend will continue? And how do you envision the realm of vascular neurosurgery in, let's say, 10 years?
Well, yeah, I think I've plotted out my aneurysm numbers over time, and it's definitely a bell-shaped curve where we're on the downslope. So, I'm curious to see where that downslope will level off, because I think there's going to be sort of a base level of cases that need to be done open, whether they're the coil or flow diverter recurrences, whether they're the bypass cases, whether they're the giant aneurysms or thrombotic aneurysms that need a decompressive component. There's going to be a certain amount of open aneurysm cases that will be necessary. But it's definitely declined. It's definitely declining. And that's disheartening. AVMs are much more stable. Cavernous malformations are much more stable. There is no endovascular treatment for these diseases that is as effective. And I think the bottom line is, again, getting back to what we said at the beginning, if you're really good at open vascular and you love it and you commit to it, then there will be a place. It will be more competitive. There'll be fewer cases, lower volumes, a harder road to competencies. But I think there'll be a place for those who, in that Darwinian perspective, make the cut. And the other thing too is that microneurosurgery is here to stay. Even though the aneurysm volume is diminishing, we still use microneurosurgery for dissecting acoustic neuromas, dissecting meningiomas. All kinds of other pathologies demand high-level microneurosurgery, and I think that until there's a robot that can take that away from us, we'll always be in demand for those kinds of applications.
And regardless of the prevalence in 10 years of microsurgery for aneurysms, how important is it, in your opinion, to capture our predecessors' experiences and your generation's experience for posterity, preserving, for instance, the knowledge of techniques that are falling out of favor today?
Oh, I think it's critical. I mean, when I think of the ophthalmic artery aneurysm, I remember when I was starting my practice, I really needed to study that anatomy because I didn't understand it. And I was seeing patients with ophthalmic aneurysms, and I didn't feel like I was doing as well of a job as I needed to do. And so I really invested a lot of effort in learning that anatomy and those techniques and achieved proficiency. And I can do those cases in my sleep. We did a great ophthalmic artery aneurysm yesterday that required a clinoidectomy and a dural ring dissection and so forth. But at the same time, this generation that's going through training today will probably flow divert those. And unless they deliberately go after that knowledge and do the cadaver dissections and spend the time to learn things inside and out, they won't have that. And so, yeah, I do think you have to really work hard to gain that knowledge and be deliberate about it, because it's becoming almost, well, it's easy to just never learn it and choose the alternative and never question that that's the way to do it. And so, if that's all you ever learn is to place a pipeline in a paraophthalmic aneurysm, and you never learn that clinoidal anatomy, you'll never be able to do it, plain and simple, because you won't see it done, you won't have mastered it yourself, and if you just go in and try it out of the blue, you'll fail. You'll fail to occlude the aneurysm. You'll have all kinds of pitfalls that will result in failure. And so I do think we have to capture these techniques for posterity, pass them along, give them to the people who are actually going to use them, and make sure that it doesn't die, because that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write Seven Aneurysms, the first of my books, was because I felt like everything I had studied and everything I had spent all those years trying to master, to climb that learning curve, that it's going to get wiped out. So somebody had to carve that Rosetta Stone, and put it on a tablet or put it on the page so that posterity would have it.
And also, it just occurred to me that in low resource environments where many of the current and future engineering advancements won't be readily available, these techniques, or these quote unquote old procedures, will still be quite salient and quite important for a long time.
Yeah, well, that's the irony, is that as we move into the future, it may be that the most resource-rich countries, the Europe's, the North Americas, are doing the least amount of open vascular neurosurgery, and that these middle and low-income countries become real training grounds or proving grounds for some of these really classic operations that, and let's be honest, they drew many of us into neurosurgery. I think when I talk to this generation of young neurosurgeons, they didn't generally go into neurosurgery to coil aneurysms. They got into the field because they saw an aneurysm clipping operation, or they saw what it's like to resect a petroclival meningioma. And the endovascular situation is sort of a compromise or a reality that's foisted upon them against their wishes. And so, there is some value to preserving these classic, heroic, open cases that really bring the surgeon in touch with neuroanatomy and really challenge the surgeon to do things that are life and death and of high consequence.
Yeah, sometimes I think about what it will be like for somebody in 100 years, the surreal experience of opening the internet and watching Dr. Lawton perform an aneurysm surgery in 2022. I think
Well,
that's
hopefully,
fascinating. I mean, I've actually got into medicine through history of medicine. That's what got me into medicine in the first place. But I don't have the possibility of, I don't know, seeing what Cushing did 100 years ago.
well, that's one of the remarkable things when you think about it. Everything that we do is performance. What Cushing
Yeah.
did in the operating room, taking out a meningioma, or one of my 7 series videos showing a heroic bypass. If it weren't for the video, no one would know that that ever happened, because when a patient dies, or even when you close the cranium and close the wound, no one will ever see all of that beauty of your construct, and that stitch work, or the way that you brought the vessels together. It's completely hidden from the universe, and it's not preserved after death in the way that a skull that's been trephined is preserved. And so, these videos become really the only monument to all of the effort that neurosurgeons expend to make these constructs and to try and rid a patient of disease or rebuild something that's broken. And that adds extra importance to this whole idea of what video stands for.
You think surgeons from the past had a better understanding of this performative aspect of surgery? I mean, the idea of an operating theater, of people actually watching the surgery being performed, did that have an impact, in your opinion, on the way that surgeons perceive their own profession and the legacy that they would leave to future generations?
Oh, yeah. I think that surgeons have always recognized the performance nature. The word operating theater just tells you right there. And, those old pictures of the amphitheaters, the Grossman Clinic, and these open surgical pits, there's definitely the performance element just kind of baked right into the culture. And I think video is nothing more than a modern version of that. And you can see everything. You can see maybe not the surgeon sweating, but you can see the hands moving, and you can see all the motion, and you magnify it by a factor of 10, and you see everything. So it's all about performance.
Wow. Yeah, I just noticed we're at 1 minute 5. My apologies. I just got caught up in the conversation. I think it's quite interesting. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
I don't want to take up any more of your time.
this has been great. I've enjoyed the conversation, and it's a real joy to do it for Mission Brain, because obviously Alfredo and I built this foundation up from the ground, and to see it thriving and seeing it move into new directions like podcasts and hackathons and new trips and new chapters and so forth.
We hope you enjoyed our episode. To be interviewed and for inquiries, email us at podcast@missionbrain.org. To donate to the foundation, please visit www.missionbrain.org.